Today, Peter was just reminding me that, in a way, Paul's lecture is the first lecture that actually, this semester, that has the word landscape in it. We've been talking about landscape in the school for quite some time. And I think we're particularly lucky this evening to have Paul with us. Paul Selman is Professor Emeritus at the University of Sheffield, and he's now living in Glasgow. But one of the, I think, extremely important aspects of Paul's work has been building new knowledge about how we think about landscape in a European context, and particularly in relation to the European Landscape Convention, to which Ireland is, in fact, a signature country, but really, in fact, actually, I was just telling Paul last night at dinner that Ireland just released, the Irish government just released a kind of a draft paper which you can download if you want at the Department of, I believe it's at the Department of Environment, although it might be at Arts, Culture, and the Gaeltacht website, which is the sort of white paper on Ireland's response to the Landscape Convention. This is something that was written in 2000 and Ireland signed in 2004. Paul edited a very interesting, did you actually start the Landscape Research Journal? You were editor for 10 years. Yeah. Journal called Landscape Research. And I think that in that period of time, the journal was used to really expand the discourse around landscape so that it could include, it wasn't just about land and scape, but in fact it's about culture, economics, about art, about social practice, about political practice, about policy, about many, many things. And I think that's really interesting. That's fundamentally critical about the way that Paul has been talking, teaching, and writing about landscape. I think this is probably, in terms of the group of people that we've had coming in to talk about landscape, Paul represents more the what I would call the knowledge base, the intelligence, the thinking part of landscape rather than the design part of landscape, which is what we're kind of maybe more familiar with in here, although he was teaching in the School of Landscape Architecture, so clearly was very involved with teaching designers and the whole pedagogy of how one teaches designers in landscape architecture. So you're very welcome, Paul. Thank you for coming, and look forward to welcoming.
Thank you. Oh, that's working. Good. Well, I was delighted to receive the invitation from Mary to come here. I come from a very different disciplinary background to you. I started out as an environmental scientist and then became a town planner, and evolved my way into a landscape architecture department, from which, as you'll see from the title Emeritus, that means retired. So until March, I was working in a landscape architecture department. Although I'm not a landscape architect as such, I think that's really my spiritual home. It's certainly where my career has taken me. And in various contexts I've worked closely with architects. But it's always useful, I think, to come into a slightly different disciplinary audience and test out your ideas and see where we've got unexpected, often common ground. So, when Merit invited me here, I think it was on the strength of a book that had written a few years ago called Planning at the Landscape Scale. I suppose if there was a title that you could put on there, it would be Landscape Planner. And in that sense, it would probably be a large scale of landscape planning, by which you might be thinking about things like national parks at the pretty end and large-scale regeneration of post-industrial areas at the grotty end. So that's kind of where I sit in a disciplinary sense. But actually, I had to go back and check what was in that book, because it wasn't exactly fresh in my mind. But basically what I attempted to do in that book was to argue that we need to think in terms of the landscape has natural scales. There are scales at which the landscape seems to work in different ways. And so I took a kind of thinking frame for the book which looked at a temporal scale, from past and present to the future, a spatial scale, from the site or local through the regional through to the transnational, and a modification scale from pristine through agricultural through to urbanic. And I suppose my broad argument was that if you're going to really work with the landscape and produce the kind of landscape effects that you want to live in functional, well-functioning landscapes, then you need to understand the natural systems, cycles, processes, patterns around which the landscape organises itself. So these might be things like water catchments, they might be things like very distinctive character areas, and so forth. The ecologists, a group of people called landscape ecologists, have been very influential in the idea of thinking about scale, because they're very interested, for example, in the kind of scales over which species life cycle processes work, and do they have enough space for their ranges. And sometimes the ranges change, say in response to climate change, where species may need to shift further south, further north. There may be problems of they're hatching before the food supply comes on source, so they need to adjust the territory in relation to that sort of effect. So landscape ecologists have been very influential in thinking about scales that matter to biodiversity. So it was that kind of thinking that was in the book. Your ideas constantly evolve, and where my ideas have been leading in the final years of my career was to explore the idea of connection. So I'll get off the first slide eventually. So you'll see really the focus of what I want to talk about tonight is reconnecting landscape, and that's sort of the working title of my new book, which I hope will be out next year. The publisher wants to call it something slightly different for commercial marketing purposes, but I think Reconnecting Landscape is the right title. It's what I've written. But first of all, the landscape bit. I don't know how you think about the landscape. You might think about designed set pieces in town. That doesn't change, and landscape is somehow something very natural. And really in Western Europe and many other parts of the world, what looks natural is actually anything but. It's hugely modified by human occupancy. Some areas obviously more extensively than others. Some areas are still relatively wild, although I don't think there are any areas in our part of the world that you could really call wilderness. They're all changing, as I'll say in a moment, but they're changing at different rates. So you may get some landscapes which are very fast change, maybe where there's even very active regeneration taking place, and there'll be some landscapes which are very slow change, and where the rate of change is imperceptible, as far as most people are concerned. But anyway, I'm going to look at this thing called the cultural landscape. The other bit that I'm going to really focus on is the idea of reconnection. And what really started me thinking about this was there's a kind of literature, almost subculture, that one of the things we need to do is kind of reconnect with the earth, with nature, with place. It's a rather essentialist argument, it's a rather metaphysical argument. There's often not a lot of evidence really to support it, but everybody seems to think that there's something in it. It can be at the outer margins of vague spirituality, or it can be right there in government policy. You see a lot of government statements about the need for children to reconnect with nature, or for people to reconnect with place or community, and those sorts of things. I think it's there in the concept of genius loci, the spirit of the place, which is very familiar to architects and urban designers. But does it exist? You actually prove to me that there is a genius loci. Actually prove to me that people attach themselves to place and have an affection for a distinctive, characterful place. Very difficult to do. So what I've set out to do in this book is try to uncover solid evidence for connection in the cultural landscape, connection between people and place and connections within the landscape, and say, are those connections breaking down? Are we becoming disconnected? If so, is that a problem? And if it's a problem, then how do we reconnect? So I wanted to look at the evidence base for that and see if there was good science, in the broadest sense, behind it, rather than just, if you like, rather wishful, essentialist thinking. So that's what I'm going to look at, but I'm going to breeze over a lot of ideas because I want you to come back at me and ask questions. And so I'll probably just skim a number of slides just to seed some ideas and let you come back. So there's two things in here really that I want to set as a sign of preamble. One is that for many people, the idea of landscape equates with scenery. And I think it's helpful for us as professionals to get away from that idea. Scenery is important, and we've rightly had programmes of scenic protection, and landscape designers are rightly concerned with creating aesthetic places. And design is often about the visual. But landscape, cultural landscape in particular, is about much more than the visual. And as professionals, we need to understand the unseen as well as the seen. So the little graphic down the side is from a pamphlet that Natural England produced called Beyond the View, Landscape Beyond the View. And the idea was to show that landscape has this rich layering. It's got this complex character which derives not only from the obvious things that you can see, like the vegetation and the rivers and the buildings, but also from the things that you can't see, such as people's experiences, memories, stories, traditions, that are all somehow embedded in that landscape. Some of them, archaeological remains, are perhaps very, very faint, perhaps only perceived by the very educated eye. There's a term which we'll just introduce now in relation to that. I think it just briefly comes up later, but this is something that I've been labouring quite a bit in recent writings. And it's a term that I stumbled upon very recently by a French writer who used the term remanence, and I think it's a very handy term. In its scientific sense, remanence is used by physicists to talk about, if you like, if you've got a piece of iron and you attach a magnet to it, it's magnetic so long as the magnet's attached. When you take the magnet away, there's still a little bit of residual magnetism in there, and they call that remanence. Similarly, information scientists will talk about information storage media, and when they wipe a disk, when they clean a disk, there is always some data on that disk that they haven't managed to erase. It's there in faint form, and they refer to that as remanence as well. And the landscape has a lot of remanence in it. Things that it's picked up over the years from human occupation and use and activities, and as I say, the stories and memories and meanings that are attached to landscape. And somehow that's detectable, discernible, and contributes to the distinct character of different places. But the other point in here is that one of the problems that I've encountered in trying to explore this idea is that, as I say, there are many different disciplines who argue about what cultural landscape is, and they bring their own particular thing to the party when it comes to saying what connection or reconnection might be. So, for example, in the bottom left, you might have the environmental scientists who look on landscape as a dynamic physical system. You may have the art historians and cultural geographers come in there as well, who study landscape in paintings, and often what is going on and the people in the painting are perhaps more important than the actual visible scene, so they can deconstruct that in various ways. You may have the physical geographer's view of landscape, or even the touristic gaze upon landscape. And it goes on. You know, the archaeologists have a take, the social psychologists have a take, all sorts of different disciplines have a take on the landscape. They all come in from different angles, they all rubbish each other's ideas and methodologies, and one of the challenges I've had is trying to reconcile these and build up a composite picture. I started out as an environmental scientist, and I went on to do postgraduate planning, and to be honest, I hated it. And during the first term, I was really on the point of dropping out. It really wasn't for me. And just before I managed to drop out, one of my tutors came along to me and produced this book which had just come out of Massachusetts, and he said, "You know, Paul, I think you'd like to read this." And it was this book by a Glaswegian architect working in Massachusetts, and it was called Design with Nature. And basically what Mac Haag said, and it was really quite radical at the time, is that rather than just imposing our footprint on the land, rather than just engineering our motorways and putting our buildings and so on it, we ought to be much more respectful of the landscape. We ought to tread more lightly. And he developed a technique of interpreting the way that the landscape was working in order to fit in more graciously our infrastructure and our settlements. And nowadays we do it with geographic information systems. Mac Haag didn't have that in those days. He did it all with traced overlays, just different factors of the landscape and looking where the areas were in the landscape that were perhaps robust and adaptable enough to accommodate human impacts. So it was really working with nature, and that kind of transformed my, put me on sort of a new trajectory, and on and off that's the pathway I've stumbled along for about 40 years. There's another way of looking at landscape, and this is a term that I believe was spontaneously coined by students at what was then Birmingham Polytechnic about a generation ago. And it came up over a sort of coffee break. It was called The Space Left Over After Planning, SLOPE. And that's the other view of landscape. You can see it down there in the foot of the slab block. Now, I hope you don't have that view of landscape, but unfortunately lots of built environment professions do. And lots of built environment professions think, oh, we'll come along and do all the important stuff like roads and buildings, etc., you know, the bridges, and then after we've done it all, we'll invite the landscapers to put a few trees in. Now, I hope that you have more of a Mac Haagian view of the complexity and sensitivity of landscape and the privilege that we have of setting ourselves in it, and the ways in which we must design, construct, engineer, and so on, to tread as lightly as possible on that cultural landscape. We needn't really dwell on this. I just say that the cultural landscape has many definitions, many people bring their own ideas, they all disagree. But here's if you want a sort of simple definition of what a cultural landscape is, if you can read that, this is quite a handy one by a policy maker, Adrian Phillips, producing a book for the management of Category 5 protected areas, which are rather like the national parks that we have in highly modified countries, rather than the wilderness national parks that you have in places like America. So his definition of what a cultural landscape was nature plus people, the past plus the present, and physical attributes plus associated values. So nature plus people, the past plus the present, and physical attributes plus associated values. And you can try and improve on that definition, but it's not bad. It's held up quite well, I think. So that sort of encapsulates the kind of landscape that I'm talking about. And I should actually say, at the time I was writing the last book, where I was then, I was still seeing the landscape very much in rural terms. That was what I was writing about. Over the past 5 years ago, I've started to see it more and more in urban terms, and see almost the urban-rural distinction as an irrelevance. And I now see the landscape sweeping right through the urban fringe, right into the green infrastructure, and having multifunctional, multi-layered landscapes of high quality everywhere. So I think I've moved away from seeing it as a predominantly rural concept. Here's a nice little paper if you manage to get hold of it. I don't know if you can read that too well, so it seems a bit grainy tonight. But it's some work that Janet Stevenson did in New Zealand. And again, it's this idea of beyond the view. What is there? What is this complex thing called landscape? How do we understand it better so that we can map it better, understand the landscape scale better, and understand the connectivities better? And again, she has, if you like, broken down this idea of landscape into things that are seen and unseen. And she's categorised them as relationships that people have with landscape, which express themselves as things like memories, meanings, aesthetics, stories and myths, spirituality, symbols, and so on. And those relationships are a way of connections. And most of those are unseen. You may detect them in the landscape. The outsiders, when we go in as professionals, as outsiders, we may never see these. Some of these may only be detected by insiders, people who've lived in the landscape, not people who look on it with a professional or touristic gaze. Practices, so historical processes, historical activities which may now have ceased, but may leave some traces. Present, contemporary human activities, ecological processes. Again, some of those will be unseen, some of them will be a bit more visible, but we don't necessarily see all the ecological processes or all the historic events and so on, but they are somehow embedded in the landscape. And then the forms of the landscape. Historic features, archaeological features and so on, the vegetation, the biodiversity, the natural landforms, and those are mostly visible. So it's this idea that the landscape again extends beyond the view. And another thing that I want to sort of impress about this cultural landscape is that most people see it as something unchanging. They see it as something very natural. And we need to, again, get beyond that idea. In these parts of the world, Western Europe and many other parts of the world, the landscape is predominantly cultural. It is people plus nature, etc. When we're understanding what's going on, and I find actually this a very useful thinking device with students to actually get them to take a favourite landscape and interpret it in these terms to get an idea of what's going on. And it's following something called the DIPSA model, driving forces, pressures, state, impact, response. And that's at the heart of all the environmental impact monitoring that we do to see whether our state of the environment is getting better. And it's been extended to landscape just to understand, well, in the first instance it was used in this sort of state of the environment type of study. Are things getting better or worse? But it can also be used as a more general way of understanding the inexorable nature of change in cultural landscapes. And so basically there are driving forces, there are drivers at work, which are things like population change, economic forces, cultural change. Those are pressures on the landscape, like pressure for housing and industrial development, very intensive farming and so on, increasingly things like renewable energy. That then leads to the landscape being in a certain state, and we will observe as a result of that landscape scale patterns and processes. The impact that our activities have on that state may be things like loss of landscape distinctiveness, loss of character, loss of connections, loss of something that we'll talk about in just a moment, which is becoming increasingly important, loss of resilience. We then have a response. What are we going to do about it if things are getting worse? Well, we have things like policies and plans. Importantly, we also have things like community action, getting people involved. We have financial incentives, etc. So various types of responses we can have. And those themselves become drivers. Policy, public intervention is itself an important driver. And it's useful to think of landscapes in this way, not least because it just gets us away from the idea of landscapes somehow being something permanent and unchanging, and see it as something which is dynamic. I think from our point of view, from the point of view of professionals who are likely to intervene, it also tells us increasingly that we've got to work with drivers. A lot of landscape planning has been about stopping change, preservation, protection, trying to close down change. And that's fine, and in places we need to do that. In places, protection has been a very, very important policy imperative. And we're very fortunate to have many of our heritage landscapes in the fine condition that they're still in. But equally, we need to understand drivers because we need, as a species really, to evolve new landscapes. And what are the drivers of new landscapes? Well, for example, in terms of urban green infrastructure, then the kind of spin-offs that we can get from housing development, the developers' agreements that you can get to put money into things like sustainable drainage, public open space, community facilities. Something like that can be a driver of new landscape. Farming, intensification can be a driver. Afforestation can be a driver. And what we need to do is learn to work with those rather than trying to close them down. Accept that they will lead to the... If we understand the landscape and we understand what's going on and we understand better how to handle drivers and influence them, then it can lead to the emergence of valued new landscapes. And that's it in a bit more detail. There's a lot of drivers taking place. This was a result of a very interesting study indeed by Natural England on the kind of change drivers that were impacting on landscape. And you can understand that if our landscape policies are just concerned with protection or just concerned with designing set pieces in the city, that's just too limited. We need this broader understanding of what's taking place. And we need to understand that this is going to, all these different things are going to impact on the way that landscape changes in the future. We aren't going to preserve the same landscape, but we can work in ways that are going to keep landscapes that are resilient, distinctive, characterful, multifunctional. So we can help to see the emergence of important new landscapes. So as you can see from this, that the landscape does a lot for us, but it isn't going to stay the same. And I find this little diagram, it's a bit of a Mickey Mouse diagram, but it's served me well over the years, just to get an idea of broadly what's happening. If you like, the cultural landscape is almost the product of local processes, of local people and their activities working in harmony with nature. And these localised processes, which sometimes can include policy and planning, planning in a sense can be a driver of localisation, it can be a reinforcer of distinctiveness. Those local processes can contribute to character and distinctiveness in the landscape. But broadly speaking, many landscapes are affected by what's happening on the outside. And we can use this very broad and overused term like globalisation, internationalisation, McDonaldisation, etc., etc. External subsumption. And these external processes are producing homogenisation and anonymisation in landscapes. So that increasingly they're looking more and more the same. And you can't so easily tell where you are in the world any longer just by looking at the landscape. It's losing its character and its distinctiveness, both seen and unseen. And this, I think, is the core challenge. There is a thing called the European Landscape Convention that is a Council of Europe convention. So it isn't like an EU directive. It isn't as strong or as forceful as that. It's Council of Europe. We sign up to it voluntarily, but having signed up to it, we then do commit ourselves to enshrining landscape in law and doing landscape policy objectives, landscape protection, landscape management, and landscape planning. And in practice, one of the most important practices that has come out of this so far has been the extension of character mapping, mapping the characteristic qualities of landscapes throughout Europe. We perhaps haven't seen too much action on the ground, but character mapping has taken a big step forward. And again, this is something in which architecture and landscape architecture have been very involved, because it entails, still mainly at a rural level at the moment, but it involves looking at what makes each area of landscape distinctive. Is there a landscape scale? Do we see cultural landscape units out there that kind of hang together and people put a name on and people can identify as being distinct areas? What are the things that make those characteristic? And what are the change drivers that are causing them to change and perhaps to be debased? So there's a lot of that kind of study taking place. So this thing called character, it's trying to, as I say, to break down the landscapes of Europe into character areas, characters that somehow have an identity, people connect with, that have a genius loci, if you like. And then understanding the change drivers in those places, if you like, the consequences of those change drivers and what we might do to intervene in order to retain character. Now, I think that's great. One of the problems, it's not a problem with the method, but one of the practical problems that we will face is that what do you do when you've got that information? Well, the temptation is always to be backward looking and saying, what can we do to recapture the character of the past? What can we mimic? You know, what pastiche can we have in neo-vernacular design so that it somehow reproduces the kind of distinctive features that people have mapped? And I think that's a risk. It will lead us to backward-looking pastiche. In general, I think we would tend to agree that that's not the best thing. However, how do we remain faithful to that character, but allow new landscapes to emerge that are in keeping with, sympathetic to that character? That's a much more creative challenge. So, connectivity in these cultural landscapes. And I think in the last book, my emphasis was on character and distinctiveness being lost. In the new book, which I say I hope will be out next year, it's much more about the connections being lost. Loss of connectivity. And many of the key types of disconnect that are being claimed in the landscape is, first of all, loss of attachment between people and place. What is this thing called place? We only use it an awful lot in urban design. Loss of connection between people and nature. So one of the arguments there, for example, is something that American writers have referred to as the extinction of experience. Children growing up in very urbanic environments, never seeing any nature apart from a few patches of weeds and the odd, feral pigeon, having no idea where milk and eggs come from. Loss of connections between past and present. Loss of traditions, customs, memories and meanings that were associated with the landscape. Loss of connectivity between ecological habitats. This is a big thing at the moment. There's a big policy emphasis on ecological networks. And there's a lot of fanciful, non-scientific talk about it as well. There has been a lot of talk about creating corridors to join up protected areas with the idea that species will be able to migrate along these corridors. Now there's some very naive thinking about that, there's some much more sophisticated thinking about it, but even in statutory plans you will see some silly statements being made about the creation of green corridors and how great those are going to be for biodiversity. There's some good, sound science there now which can help us to do this well, and it's extremely necessary to counter the loss of biodiversity and to help biodiversity adapt to climate change. Loss of connectivity, loss of linkages in the hydrological system. Again, this isn't fanciful. Some very hard-nosed engineers hydraulics experts have written about engineered disconnection in the floodplain. In other words, the way that in cities in particular, we seal surfaces. And I'm sure you're all aware of the kind of problems that creates for runoff, pluvial flooding, and also the way that we modify river banks to try and prevent flooding of economically important resources, which often just shift the problem downstream. So there's now a lot of emphasis, if we can, on unsealing the city and creating sustainable urban drainage systems, for example. Lots of connection between economic activity and its local setting. We don't, what really created our valued cultural landscapes was relatively labour-intensive farming. Types of farming which were constrained by the environment of the area, its soils, its rainfall, and so on. And those linkages that created the cultural landscapes, again, are being broken. Might we have new linkages between economic activity and landscape, which can help to drive new types of valued landscape? Lack of effective physical connectivity and active transport networks in towns. It's very difficult to cycle or even walk in a pleasant way through most urban areas. It's too dangerous. There are bits of networks, but they're not sufficiently joined up or pleasant. And those networks have a chance to be multifunctional, to do more than one thing at once. And loss of connection between town and country. We have this messy urban fringe, which has been the subject of a lot of literature. Rather than a sort of intra-urban, peri-urban area, which serves as a gateway to the countryside, a bridge to the countryside, and a gateway to the town. So lots of connectivity there, and this sharp distinction between town and country. Right, okay, so a little bit more about some of those connections. Just to say, and I can't really go into detail here, but just to say that I have uncovered a great deal of good evidence to say that yes, people do connect to place. There's evidence about biophilia, that is, if you like, an evolutionary attachment that we have to nature, and therefore a biological need to see green in our environment. A whole range of health and well-being connections to the environment, to the landscape, both in terms of getting people out to be a bit more active, do a bit more walking, and therefore have conducive spaces, but also the whole idea of green areas being restorative, mentally restorative to people, and that has been well measured and well documented. The whole idea of genius loci, resonance, this whole idea of sense of place, the idea of social capital, of networks of associations of knowledge between people, trust, reciprocity between people, and the ways in which that can be mediated through landscape. This idea of sense of place is often related to place identity, and the social psychologists, again, have got lots of good evidence on specific things like place identity, place attachment, and place dependence. They're all rather different things that can be measured in different ways. And an interesting idea that a cultural geographer called Ken Ulwig came up with, you probably are aware that sheep heft to a particular pasture. They tread the pasture, they become accustomed to it, they become attached to that pasture, and they know the way around it and understand where the fresh grass will be and so on, but they become psychologically somehow imprinted on that particular part of the moor. And Ken Ulwig has suggested that actually that happens to people as well when we tread routinely, customarily, a particular landscape. It's using it perhaps more in a metaphorical than a scientific sense, but it's an interesting idea that actually we heft to our own patch of landscape through repeated walking of it. It kind of passes into our feet. Lots of good evidence now on this idea of ecological connectivity, the idea of habitat networks in the top left there. Very interesting study in Edinburgh, which used a landscape ecological, a very scientific mathematical model to look at how to put connections in between key sites, key ecological sites in Edinburgh, mainly looking at woodland and heathland sites. So quite a lot of rural sites, but also sites encapsulated within the city. And they also combined that, they used exactly the same model to look at how people moved between patches as well. So these patches are fulfilling a social function, health and well-being, play, identity function, and so on. And they applied the same landscape ecological to the way that people move between these, and have merged the two to hopefully produce a social ecological network, not just something for the beasts. Something that we can completely forget about because we can't see it, but connectedness in terms of the atmosphere. There's obviously a lot of information I'm sure you're familiar with about the connections in terms of carbon sequestration and the role that landscape can have in climate change, adaptation and mitigation. So that's a fairly well-known connection. But there's also this whole idea of airsheds, big green landscape within cities to moderate the microclimates. I'm sure you're familiar with the urban heat island effect, the way that cities gain temperature during the day and lose temperature rapidly during the night because of the hard surfaces and the high level of tarmac, black surface and so on. We've got this urban heat island effect. Well, that can get quite serious. One of the last big things that I was involved in at Sheffield was that departments were in what was then the tallest building in Sheffield. That's just been overtaken, but since the 1960s it's been the tallest building, the Arts Tower. And really it hadn't had much spent on it since the mid-60s, and it was becoming very dilapidated. So we, through a lot of politicking and pressure in the university, we eventually persuaded them to spend a lot of money, megabucks, on refurbishing it. It was a huge project we had to decant for a couple of years whilst it was done. And one of the things which really struck me whilst we were doing this refurb was that we looked at the cooling system and we were looking at possibilities of mechanical ventilation, air conditioning systems. It was actually very difficult to retrofit that into this building. The actual, features of the design actually made it physically very difficult and expensive to contemplate that system. So we thought, well, let's be environmentally friendly and just have natural cooling. We'll have the windows. We'll maximise the natural circulation of air in the building. And that's a greener solution anyway, so we'll go for that. So we actually did some models on whether the building would be uncomfortable. Because it was a bit of a heat exchange, it could get a bit like a glass house in the summer. We looked at how many days it would be difficult to work there. And the model showed about 30 days a year it might be a bit uncomfortable to work in. So I said, okay, we'll live with it. We'll settle for the natural solution. Then we built in the climate change models, global warming. And when you factor those in, bearing in mind this has to have a refurb period of 30 or 40 years, when you look 30 or 40 years into the future, there were about 100 days in the year when we'd be in discomfort. We still lived with the natural solution, we didn't put in air conditioning. But it makes you think. The only real solution to that, I don't think there's an engineering solution. I think the main solution is going to be looking at these airshed solutions, and there's now some very, very good evidence, a wonderful study done in Manchester on exactly how that can be combated through landscape design in various parts of the city. And we're talking big. We're talking about this now as being a major driver of urban form. Hydrological connectivity, I've already said a bit about that. Trying to look at ways of overcoming the engineered disconnection that's occurred within our water systems between groundwater, surface water, water in river channels and so on. And of course sea surges, the whole coastal issue. But again, big implications for design in terms of sustainable drainage systems, green roofs, quite major ways in which this can be tackled through imaginative design and potentially transforming the functionality and appearance of urban areas. One of the things that I'm promoted in the last book, and again looking at it in this book in terms of economic connectivity, if you like, trying to get economic activities to drive new landscapes, is something called the virtuous circle. And in a way where we've got fine landscapes at the moment, they have been driven by this virtuosity. In other words, it's been economically worthwhile investing in the land. It perhaps hasn't been done consciously, but the reason that farmers and so on have produced these fine landscapes is because it paid them to do so. The landscape was giving them a product because they cared for the land in particular ways, and they invested in the land in particular ways. Now, many of those links have been broken, but can we look to new links that help to new economic activities that drive valid new landscapes? If we can't, we're in trouble. It needs this virtuous link, or else, in some parts of the countryside, we have a vicious circle, often associated with depopulation, land abandonment. That isn't necessarily good for nature. You can get a loss of biodiversity, encroachment of scrub, and quite a lot of problems. So what you want is virtuous circles, if that's still possible. Here's an example that's interesting to contemplate. A former colleague of mine, called Henry Bullock, did a big study to say, can we taste biodiversity? And he set up all sorts of taste panels, and he teamed up with a vet lab and so on. And basically traced very carefully where animals were being grazed, traces right through the food cycle, and held food panels with people, restaurants and so on, and actually found that people attached a premium to, without knowing it was all done double blind, without knowing which meat you were eating, attached a clear premium to meat that had been reared on biodiverse lands. So you could charge more for it. It was high quality, traceable, high value meat. So that could be a virtuous circle. It pays the farmer to invest in biodiversity because there's a payback through a landscape premium. And there are many others we can contemplate associated with industrial estates, associated with renewable energy, all sorts of contemporary drivers that we can look at to manipulate this virtuous circle. I will just in passing say that I think that one of the things that we need to understand when we're making decisions is what does sustainability mean. I won't dwell on that. All I would say is that I've explored what we mean by sustainable landscape. There's a paper on it on the website if you want to look at it in more detail. But what I would argue about sustainability, you can rubbish it if you like, but it is something that is strongly socially endorsed. It has been a meta-narrative in the past generation. It's been extensively politically debated. So if we're wanting some sort of touchstone, then looking at sustainability is not a bad idea. If we want some justification for what we're doing, some validation, some democratisation for what we're doing, then sustainability is not a bad guiding light. I would say a few more words about a concept which I think is becoming increasingly important. I don't know if you've come across it specifically in this context, but if you haven't, then you've heard it here first. I'm sure it's going to be a big thing. Resilience. Surprisingly, given how central this is now in government policy, from food security through to national security, through to environmental management, everyone's talking about resilience. It's a key word of government policy. Despite that, there has been no single definition. I found a few that more or less say the same thing, but there's no simple definition. There's been specific definitions, for example, in relation to ecological networks. But one of the nicest I've found, and this was in the context of coastal management, resilience implies the ability of the system to bounce back or return to some quasi-stable state. And so one of the main things that I've found about connection and reconnection is that it underpins resilience. It's very difficult to have a resilient landscape that is fragmented and disconnected. If you want a resilient landscape, you have to look at defragmenting and reconnecting it in the very, very broadest terms. And that applies socially as well as ecologically. There's Okay. There's a physical side to resilience. So that, for example, the London Climate Change Project looked at its habitats and said these are scarcely resilient. The resilience is being undermined by a range of things that are happening. And what you have is landscapes that are on the point of disintegration. They've lost the resilience because of a range of impacts. Now, I don't know if you've come across Donald Rumsfeld, the former US Defence Secretary. I don't know if you've come across his classification of knowns and unknowns, but this is a nice way of thinking about it, and I'm aware of the time. I'll finish within 5 minutes. I think Donald Rumsfeld was thought of as a bit of a buffoon when he said this, but actually people have seen a real wisdom in it later on. And he said, we're surrounded by knowns and unknowns. There are the known knowns, the things that we know, and we know. Okay, so a lot of the time you've got well-trodden paths. You're designing solutions for situations that have previously been encountered. We know how buildings work, etc., etc. We're in the territory of known knowns. And if you're there, you can fix the problem. You can do it by standard command and control, technical solutions, predict and fix. There are some things which are, and I hope I've got these the right way round, I think I have. There are some unknown knowns. In other words, people out there have knowledge which could be useful to us, but we don't know. But somebody knows. So, for example, military satellites might have very valuable information about ecological networks from their ground sensing, but they aren't telling us because it's classified. Or quite often just because of the sheer volume of research that's coming out, the tens of thousands of papers that are coming out every year on all the different subjects. The information's out there, but we just haven't stumbled across that silver bullet which would really help us in our practice. And so we're increasingly looking towards things like systematic review to help us in that. There are the known unknowns. So things that we know in broad terms, but we don't know the precise parameters. So something like future climate change. We know it's happening. We've run some pretty sophisticated models, so we've got it fairly well mapped out, but we don't know in detail what's going to happen. So we can make some preparations and provisions, but we don't know precisely whether we're going to cope or what's going to happen. So there are known unknowns. And there are unknown unknowns. Things that we haven't even started to worry about because we don't know what they are. But there will be some future shocks. We haven't worked out what they are yet. And those are the unknowns. Unknown unknowns. And we're progressively heading in that direction as we go into climate change in a world of 10 billion people by the end of this century. And the argument that I would hypothesise is that when we're in the known knowns, then traditional prediction, traditional fixes work. As we move more towards unknown unknowns, all we can do is try and build resilience in the system so that it can bounce back. Build the resilience in nature, in our cities, etc., so that it can recover more easily from future shocks. The social resilience, it isn't just, for example, about building a new seawall, it's about, if you like, people's willingness to accept different levels of flood, people's understanding of the situation, the capacity of institutions to respond and cope. Beyond resilience, there is something very specific called resilience theory. I go into quite a bit of detail in the book, but now isn't the time. But basically, what this talks about is social ecological systems. And you can argue that those social ecological systems in which you're trying to build resilience can almost be equated with cultural landscapes. And that what they argue, basically, is that we are in one basin of attraction which is working pretty well. If we get too close to the tipping point, if you think of that London habitat study, we're getting close to tipping points, we tip over into another basin of attraction which isn't so nice and which is very difficult to climb out of, and so we try and understand those tipping points. Some people have explained the 2008 financial crisis in exactly these terms. We haven't got a resilient system, it was a brittle system, and we tipped from one basin to another, and it's very difficult to tip yourself back. And finally, I think the very final thing that I want to say about this is that we are professionals who intervene. We have ideas about what would be a good landscape, what would be a good city. But we need to validate those. We can't just impose our own ideas. We need them to be democratised. And one of the ways in which this is happening in landscape is through the medium of landscape quality objectives. This is something that the European Landscape Convention requires of us. And there are ways that we're now going through and developing those and saying, well, what the experts, what the stakeholders, what the general public feel about where they want that landscape to travel in the future. And it's as much about building knowledge and so on as it is about fixing the problem. The Catalan government has been very progressive on this. They've developed one of the most interesting sets so far of landscape quality objectives for their many different landscape character types. Natural England have a very interesting project at the moment, landscape as an integrating approach in Natural England, the aim. So this is taking this very landscape scale integrated approach of the subject, which is bringing together all the amenity people, the ecology people and so on. They are developing integrated objectives which will be attached to the national character areas and monitored through a programme called SAUL. So I think this is an important way forward. You know, we recognise the need to intervene, but we must do so on a democratic and mediated basis. And just finally, where this takes us is looking towards, not trying to pickle just the landscapes of the past, but looking towards emergent, new, sustainable, resilient landscapes. And the strapline that's coming through is more, bigger, better, joined. I've put it in terms of more space for nature, more place for people, and maximising the connections between those. And there I think, I sort of talked for 50 minutes or so, I think that's about it.